Hello and welcome to this presentation, especially for Brittania Skies pilots. My name is Jerome. I'm your instructor. In my daily life, I'm a professional pilot, but in my free time, I also love to fly on flight sim. And if you're wondering, yes, I still have a very happy marriage. She's not listening now. Anyway. This presentation is about the Garmin G1000 flight deck. It's an amazing piece of kit. I know lots of you guys love to fly more a traditional aircraft like the Husky or the Cub or the Cessna 152. And as you notice, they all have separate instruments. That requires you to look at various different places at the same time. There is a scanning technique, and maybe that's a nice subject to talk about on a blog or something like that. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to know more about scanning techniques for the traditional instrumentation. Anyway, the Garmin G1000 is an EFIS system, which is an electronic flight instrument system. And that allows you to have all that important information in one place, so you don't have to scan the whole cockpit to find out what your attitude is, how high you are, where you're flying to, and all that stuff. So I find it's an amazing piece of kit. So without further ado, let's have a look at the Garmin G1000 flight deck. As you can see, you have two massive screens there and a whole lot of buttons. Now we call the left screen your primary flight display, your PFD, and the right screen is called the navigation display. Now it looks all pretty impressive, all those buttons, but if you look closely, most of those buttons are just duplicated on each screen. So you actually get half of them. So let's have a run through all of those buttons quickly. I'll explain more on some of those buttons later on, and some buttons I will explain in one of the future presentations. So on the left side of the screen, of each screen, you have the buttons mostly for navigation. For example, this button that allows you to set the volume for identification of your radio navigation beacons. These radio navigation frequencies, you can see here on the right hand side, those are the active frequencies, and you can see there's already an ident behind it. The bottom one is Pole Hill, and the top one is the ILS frequency for Blackpool, which is where we are in this stage. Now that button here, that changes the standby frequencies to active. So it moves this frequency to the right. That's how you change frequencies. This button here is a multifunction button, and that will allow you to set frequencies which are in the standby box. You can see a little square around the one that I've selected. Now, if you toggle the ring, the outer ring, it'll change this part before the dots. And if you move the inner knob, then it'll change the decimals. If we go further down, this is your heading book. And these buttons here allow you to engage the autopilot, the flight director, and all that stuff. More on that in a future presentation. This button is also a multifunction button, and it's the altitude selection button. Now, multifunction means that, of course, you got an inner ring and you got an outer ring, but you can also press them, right? So, for example, if you want to change the top frequency here, you have to press the button, and then this little box will turn over to the top frequency, and then you can use the outer ring and the inner knob to change that frequency. And obviously to activate it, you press that button. That's how that works. Now, already touched on this screen, so that's a screen that is the navigation radio display. On the bottom, you see a whole row of buttons. Oh, let's go back. all those buttons here, they all change functions depending on what stage of the flight you are or what your display is saying. So I call them soft buttons. In the middle, you have the flight plan progress bar. More about that later on. And on the right, you have the voice radio frequencies. And again, it works exactly the same as on the left when you select frequencies. So you use this button to change the frequencies, that button to activate them. And this button is for your overall volume. That button, of course, like I said, it's duplicated on both sides. That button is very important. It has your altitude setting, that's the outer ring, and the inner ring is your course selector. This button on your primary flight display is not that important. This is the range button. It becomes important on this screen. If you select the range to, if you change the range, then you can see more of the route. I'll show you later on. These buttons are for your flight plan, and the FMS button is also for your flight plan, but also you can use that to change settings and do all kinds of stuff related to the deeper layer of the system. So configuration settings and stuff like that. And again, I'll probably talk about that in one of the future presentations. Now, as I said, this comms panel here in the middle, it doesn't really apply to us. In the flight sim, we don't really use that. So we'll skip that one for now. So let's have a look at the primary flight display. As I said, all your information is all gathered in one central point in the middle. So this part is called the primary flight display, and these are your primary instruments. On the side, the peripherals are your secondary instruments. As you see, this is the sky pointer, and it's also called a roll indicator. This little semicircle is always aligned with the horizon. And it's this little triangle that moves when you roll or bank. Every little marking is 10 degrees. So this is 10, that's 20, that's 30 degrees, and so on and so on. That little line here underneath indicates whether you roll in a coordinated turn. If that moves to the left or right, that means that your center of gravity is shifted. And to keep your center of gravity in the middle of the aircraft, you need to use a little bit of rudder. So if you, for example, roll to the right, you need a little bit of right rudder to keep that little line in the middle. Now, if you have your flight sim settings, your rudder settings set to automatic, you don't have to do that. Obviously, if it's set to manual, then you have to use a little bit of rudder during the turn. In the big jets, the one that I fly, it doesn't really matter because you've got two engines and it's a fly-by-wire. So my rudders my turns are always coordinated. Now, the next one is your pitch, your attitude indicator. That will show you how high your nose is in relation to the horizon. It doesn't necessarily show you how fast you're climbing. So it's fairly straightforward. If you point your nose down, you go and descend. If you pull your nose up, you're going to climb. That's a very important instrument, the horizontal situation indicator. It tells you which direction you're flying. It's got a compass rose, and it also has an indication of what heading you're going here. This is the heading selection window. I find that pretty important to use because usually when I decide to turn, I set the heading to a heading that I want, and that will show up here. And that's closely related to the heading bug there. Well, as you can see, heading is 360, so the heading bug is set to north. Once I've set that, then I'll start my turn to make sure that that heading bar gets to the top of the screen. Now this one is your course selection window. When you fly a flight plan on GPS, what it is now, it'll tell you what the track is to the next waypoint. So that'll show you what track you have to fly to get to your next waypoint. It's not necessarily the same as the heading, because as I explained in my second blog, if you have a crosswind, you'll have to adjust your heading to maintain a certain track. If you'd like to know more about heading and track and the relationship between the two, including the wind correction and all that stuff, just let me know. I can explain that a little bit further. And closely related to that is your course deviation indicator. That will indicate how far off your course you are. There will be like a line in the middle, a magenta line, and it'll show, if you're on course, it'll show dead center. And obviously if you're left or right, of course, it'll give you an indication of how far left or right you are. Now, if you want to fly ILS, for example, this will turn into, or you can turn it into a green uh, course deviation indicator. And you can then set the track to the inbound track of your runway, for example. More on that probably in one of the future presentations. So that's your primary flight instruments. Now let's go to the secondary flight instruments. That's your airspeed indicator, for example. Pretty important because, you don't want to stall, but you don't want to overspeed either. So obviously that's where your speed is showing. It's ... now because we're on the runway 28 in Blackpool. Now, if I would put the power on, you'll see a trend vector, which is a little green, or I think green or yellow line that indicates how fast you're accelerating. It will show up here on the right. Now, if you're wondering what these are, those are your reference speeds. It's pretty handy that they're there. It probably it tells you, for example, what your rotation speed is in the Cessna 172. So R is your rotation speed, 55 knots. Then the X, that's the best angle of climb. So when you hit 62 knots and you maintain 62 knots, you have the best climb angle, not necessarily the fastest climb. Now, if your engine fails, for example, and you want to cover the most distance, this is the speed that you need to keep in the descent to cover the most distance. That's your best glide speed. This is the speed that you need to fly if you want to climb the fastest. That's the best rate of climb speed. So that's all the reference speeds on the secondary flight instruments. Now let's go to the right side. As I said before, this window is the window where you set the altitude, and the altitude is set by using this altitude selection button. So with the outer ring, you set the thousands of feet, and the inner knob, you set the 100 feet. That little arrow there on the side, that's your vertical speed indicator. It'll show you by position and by number how fast you're climbing or descending. So for example, if you're climbing with 500 feet a minute, it will stick around here, and the numbers will show 500. Obviously, that's your altitude indicator. And as you notice, your altitude indicator now is not set to 0. Why? Because Blackpool Airport has an elevation of 39 feet. That's why it's just stuck underneath the 40. Now, to set the right elevation, because if you read my first blog, you'll know that it depends on the weather. So every time before you fly, you listen to the ATIS, and the ATIS will tell you what the altimeter setting is. And that's how you set the altimeter. This is the altimeter setting window, And to set the altimeter, you use this knob. That's the outer ring of the coarse barrow knob. Okay, so have a look at the navigation display then. There you go, there's your navigation display. So as I said, all the buttons here are exactly the same as on the PFD. And so all the frequencies of the navigation radio, you can set it here and activate them as I explained before. Same with the voice frequency, voice radio frequencies over there. This is a very interesting one. Those are your engine indications, the temperatures and pressures. Now in real life, what you do is you taxi towards the runway and then you find a spot just away from the runway, probably here somewhere. Then you set an RPM of 3,000 feet, 3,000 RPM, and then you check your T's and P's. And if your T's and P's are all on the green, then that's it. You're good to go. You check your altimeters and alternators and all that stuff as well. So that's what you do with this screen. You just check whether they're in the green. Now this is an interesting button as well. That's the engine soft button. If you press that, then you have the option to select EGTs. So that's the engine temperatures, and that will help you to lean the engine when you're at altitude. When you're on the ground, the air is usually thicker than when you're at 7,000 feet. The air will be thinner. So at 7,000 feet, you probably don't need as much fuel to air ratio as you need on the ground. So that's why that lean, so if you press that button, there will be a screen coming up. It's called leaning. That lean screen is very important, so you can lean your engine to the ideal fuel mixture. Now there will also be another screen when you press that, and it will show you everything about your fuel, how many gallons of fuel you have on board, how many gallons you're using per hour, and how many gallons you've used so far. It'll also show the amount of oil and all that stuff. I find that very handy because I use those gallons and then I'll convert them into liters, and I'll use that for my logbook. For example, my Brittania Skies logbook. So if you want to know more about that conversion, just let me know. I'll tell you what the conversion rate is that I use. Now in the middle there, that's your navigation map. That's the progress you're making if you have a flight plan in there. You see on the left hand side that will show your ground speed. Obviously it's 0 because we're not moving. See. But ground speed is not necessarily the same as your airspeed. For example, you might have a headwind. So if you have a 10 knot headwind, your ground speed will be probably 10 knots lower than your airspeed. And it also has to do with how thin the air is. Higher up, your airspeed will probably be lower than your ground speed. So that's ground speed. Now the DTK, that's your desired track. That's if you have a flight plan in there, that's the track you have to fly to get to your next waypoint. This one, the TRK, that's the track that you're currently set to fly. Because we're on runway 28, we are going to fly a track of 276. It's not necessarily the track that we want to get to, but obviously we can't just fly backwards. Now this is that's the estimated time of your en route point. So once you take off, this will show the time that it takes to get to your next navigation point. Now we talked about the range switch before. Now with this screen, it's pretty important. You can change the range on this screen. So if you toggle that, then you'll see more of the airport, or you see less of the airport and you see more of your surroundings. zoom in and zoom out, so to speak. And these are your flight plan configuration buttons. And I'll tell you all about that in one of the next slides. Now, here's a route that I prepared for you. So we are planning to take off from Blackpool, go to Barton Airport in Manchester, do a little touch and go maybe, or just do an en route, and go via Pole Hill, which is that one, that's the VOR beacon, to Leeds Bradford Airport. Now you will see in the middle that now all of a sudden you have a desired track. So your desired track to Barton Airport is a track of 110, which is more or less southeastbound. And of course, we're still on the runway, so we are doing a track of 279. So you know that you need to turn left or right to get to the desired track. Now, if you find that there's too much detail on this screen, I've already turned this down, because if all the details are showing, it'll show intersections, it'll show VOR beacons, it'll show everything. And with a range like this, because it's a bigger range, right? With a range like that, you can't really determine what's what. So if you want to turn the details down, you just press that button and you have, I think, 4 settings. 4th being the highest detail, it'll show everything, and 1 being almost no details. You won't even see all the airports. No, detail 2 shows you the airports, and it shows you the en route VORs. So that's the details button. Now let's have a look at the flight plan button, shall we? This is the direct to button. When you press that, it basically ignores the flight plan and it'll ask you to enter either a waypoint or a VOR beacon or an airport that you want to directly fly to. To select the airport, you can toggle this switch. You have to press, I'll show you in one of the future presentations, but quickly you'll have to press the button. That'll activate the screen to select the airport. You toggle the inner knob to start toggling, go through the alphabet, and this will move the cursor to the next place, and then you go through the alphabet again. I'll probably show you how to do that on one of our future presentations. So once you entered that with the enter button, it'll completely ignore all this. And for example, if I've put Leeds Bradford as a direct to, it'll go straight to Leeds Bradford. That's the direct to button. The menu button will show you a menu depending on what you see here on the screen. For example, if I brought up the flight plan and I press the menu button, it'll give you the option either to delete the flight plan or to reactivate the flight plan. There's a lot of grayed out options as well, and that's either depending on the sim again or depending on the type of aircraft. Now that's the flight plan button, and when you press that, you'll get the flight plan up, and you'll see the flight plan in you'll see some more details of the waypoints. I think I've got prepared a slide for you after this one. Now the proc button, it's short for procedure, and with the proc button you can add a departure to your departing airport, and you can add an arrival and an approach to the arriving airport. And that's basically, it's advanced stuff. If you want to do instrument flying, that would be a great thing to do. Usually, if you are flying visually, what you do is you just do a join, and you don't do any arrivals or approaches. But it's nice to know how to do that. Clear button. If you made a mistake, press that button. Hopefully, it'll clear that mistake. And the enter button, that's to execute your choices. Notice in this screen that north is pointing upwards. Now you can change the direction of your map. You can also configure it to show the direction of flight. In this case, you can do that by going into the configuration. And I'll show you how to do that on one of the next presentations. FMS button, I find it a very important button. It's a bit fiddly at first, but once you know how the system works, it is quite handy to use. Now, if you toggle the outer ring of that FMS button when you're in map mode, it'll show you this little screen. You can see there's a few tabs here. One tab is the map. It always shows you that one. Next tab is waypoint, AUX, flight plan, and nearest. I won't go through all of them, but I'll show you this one. And as I said, you can toggle that with the outer button. And then when you use the inner button, you can select traffic map. Now let's have a look at what the traffic map looks like. Now this is what it looks like. Basically, it's like a radar kind of screen. It says standby now because we've not taken off yet. But once we're in the air, that standby will be gone. And you will see all the aircraft that are operating around you. Now for a Cessna, 24 miles is a little bit on the large side. You probably want to know more what's around you within 10 miles. So I would change the range to change that. But it's a nice it's a nice representation of what you see around you. So that's the traffic map. Now the other thing that I find really interesting is your nearest. You can see there's a few options in the nearest box. You can see nearest airports, nearest intersection, NDBs, and VORs. Now, if you want to know more about NDBs and VORs, I'm thinking of setting up an instrument course where I explain everything about those navigation radio beacons and all that stuff. Let me know if you're interested, and if I got enough interest on that, then I'll start planning the instrument course. Now you see nearest airport is active. That means that you'll see all the airports that are closely around you. You can see that Blackpool, of course we're on Blackpool, and it shows you all the details of Blackpool. 31 feet elevation, the runway direction, and what surface it is and how long it is. And that box will disappear. Underneath it, it'll show you the radio frequencies, the voice frequencies of this airport. So it's quite a nifty feature. Now, this is your flight plan. So that's what you see when you press the flight plan button. And as I said, I prepared this route. So from Blackpool to Wharton to Barton Airport, Pole Hill, and then Leeds Bradford. Here's all the details that you can see. So it'll only take us, 5 miles to get to Barton. Look at the altitude. Wow. I'm lucky if I can get that in the 172. Anyway, so if you would want to change options on that, what you do is you use this button, you press it when you can turn the outer ring to go to those lines there. And when you press it and toggle the inner knob, then you get the alphabet system again. And then you can select any navigation aid or intersection or airport that you want to add to this list. So that's how that works. That's what you get when you press the procedure button. So obviously for Blackpool, you can select a departure procedure. And once you toggle the outer ring to that point and you press it, then you'll see a load of options which departure procedures are available at Blackpool. And then you can select the appropriate option. Same for the arrival. Now the difference between an arrival and an approach is the arrival, that's called a star, and that's a standard arrival procedure, and it brings you to the initial approach point for the approach. The approach is, for example, an ILS or an RNF approach or a VOR approach. Now, more on that on a future instrument course. And I already talked about that button. It's pretty important. And once you're done, you just press enter and that will execute the whole thing. So, in summary, we have the primary display, the navigation display, and all the buttons, or most of the buttons, are duplicated across the two displays. You got round switches, and those are usually multi-switch. So the outer ring, select menu options, the inner ring, you can change configuration options, and obviously you can also press it to select it. Those are the multifunctional switches. Now, the primary flight display, we talked about the sky pointer, which is the roll indicator, the pitch indicator, the horizontal situation indicator, which is the compass rose, where you're going, airspeed indicator, very important, you don't want to stall, with a speed window, a speed trend, reference speeds, the altitude indicator, where you want to climb to, selected altitude, that's it, that's where you want to climb to. You have the altitude indicator, that's the altitude that you're at, and the vertical speed indicator. And as you remember, it has both digits and position. And of course, very important, altimeter settings. The heading book and the track indicators and track deviation indicator. Now, from the navigation display, we went through quite a few subjects. So you have the map display, the details toggle switch. Well, it's actually a soft switch, not a toggle switch. You have the range button, changes the how much you see on the screen. The FMS switch, very important, with an outer ring that can change the map display or the waypoints, or you can also change settings, and as I said, more on that on a future presentation. You can have a look at your flight plan with that and the nearest point of interest. You got the FPL buttons, the flight plan buttons, direct to, talked about that. The menu button, which will depend on where you are on the screen, what you have selected there. It has settings, procedure button, you can change an arrival and a departure procedure. And the enter button, and that's to execute it. That's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. And let me know what you think. And if you have any questions or remarks, or want to know more about a certain subject, or have an idea on what presentation to do next, let me know. And I'll get back to you on that one. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye for now.